When the bombs stopped falling, the hardest battle began, rebuilding not just cities, but faith in humanity itself. The year was 1945. The guns had finally gone silent. What had once been the most powerful nations on Earth now lay in ruins. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. The skies were filled with the smoke of destruction that refused to clear. London was scarred by years of bombing. Berlin was a wasteland of broken buildings and broken dreams. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were haunting shadows of what used to be life. Across continents, millions of families mourned, not just the dead, but the world they had lost. The economy had collapsed, the map had been redrawn, and humanity faced a new kind of war. Not of soldiers and weapons, but of survival, hunger, and despair. Yet, amid the devastation, something extraordinary began to stir. From the ashes of war, a spirit awoke, the human will to rebuild, to rise and to begin again. It wasn't just governments or armies that started the work of restoration. It was ordinary men and women who refused to let their suffering define the future. They had lost everything, homes, jobs, loved ones, but they still had one thing left: hope. Factories that once produced tanks began producing tractors and automobiles. Scientists who had designed weapons turned their genius toward medicine, engineering, and technology. Nations that had been bitter enemies sat at the same tables, not to plan destruction, but to design peace. The Marshall Plan breathed life into Europe, helping countries stand on their feet again. In Asia, nations like Japan began a transformation so remarkable that historians would later call it an economic miracle. But rebuilding the world wasn't just about physical structures. It was about rebuilding trust, morality, and faith in humanity itself. The United Nations was born, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a promise that nations would talk before they fought. Out of the ruins came a determination: never again. The streets of post-war cities were filled with sounds of hammers, saws, and hope. Children returned to schools that had once been bomb shelters. Families planted gardens where craters once stood. Artists painted visions of peace. Poets wrote about forgiveness. And leaders began to dream of unity instead of power. The world had seen its darkest night. But dawn was coming, not through miracles, but through effort, cooperation, and courage. People learned to work together in ways they never had before. The war had shown how destructive division could be. Now, unity became the new weapon of progress. In America, soldiers returned home with lessons from the battlefield: discipline, resilience, and a desire to build something meaningful. In Europe, nations like Germany and France, once bitter rivals, began working together to build what would eventually become the European Union, a bold experiment in peace and partnership. Meanwhile, technology began to evolve faster than ever before. Wartime innovation was redirected toward creation instead of destruction. Airplanes became symbols of travel, not war. Radar led to advancements in communication. Science that had been used to harm now began to heal. The world entered a new age of invention and imagination, proving that knowledge, when guided by compassion, could change everything. But not everything was easy. The scars of war ran deep. Many faced poverty, homelessness, and trauma that words could never express. Yet what separated this generation from others was their refusal to surrender to hopelessness. They didn't wait for perfect conditions to start rebuilding. They started with what they had. A brick here, a wall there, a plan, a prayer, a promise. In every nation, small acts of courage sparked larger movements of change. Communities formed cooperatives. Governments invested in education. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, proving that rebuilding required everyone's strength. The idea of equality began to take shape in real ways. The world was rebuilding not just for survival, but for progress. People began to dream again of better homes, better schools, better futures. What once was a battlefield became a workshop for ideas, for innovation, and for peace. The greatest victory after World War II wasn't military. It was moral. Humanity realized that the real measure of strength is not how much power one nation holds, but how much compassion it shows to others. From the ashes of destruction rose the spirit of cooperation. From division came unity. From despair came determination. And from one of the darkest moments in human history came one of the brightest, a global movement toward rebuilding the world. Piece by piece, heart by heart, every skyscraper that stands today, every bridge that connects, every institution that promotes peace, they are not just structures. They are symbols of what humanity can achieve when it refuses to stay broken. This is not just history, it's a lesson. When everything falls apart, when the world turns to dust, the human soul still carries within it the blueprint to rebuild, stronger, wiser, and more united than before. Because the story of rebuilding after World War II is not just about nations rising, it's about people rising. It's about the unbreakable belief that no matter how deep the fall, humanity will always find a way to stand tall again. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was louder than the bombs. Across continents, nations stood in ruins, and the question echoing in every survivor's heart was the same. Where do we go from here? In Europe, destruction stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. Bridges had collapsed, factories were gutted, and homes were piles of debris. The people who survived weren't thinking about prosperity, they were thinking about survival. They had to find food, rebuild roads, restart power lines, and somehow rekindle the spark of normal life. But the miracle of the post-war world began with something simple: human willpower. No one waited for someone else to fix things. People picked up shovels, hammers, and whatever hope they could find. The same hands that once carried rifles now laid bricks. In Germany, once the heart of destruction, a quiet revolution began. The people had nothing. Their nation was split, their currency was worthless, and their identity was broken. Yet in that vacuum, determination took root. They worked day and night to rebuild cities, factories, and trust. Within a few years, the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, had transformed ruins into rising skylines. Germany's story became living proof that no defeat is final unless you stop trying. Across the Channel, Britain faced a similar struggle. London was scarred, food was rationed, and the economy was drained. But the British people had survived the Blitz. Their spirit was unshakable. Citizens volunteered to rebuild public buildings, schools, and hospitals. They didn't just want to restore the old, they wanted to create a better society. The National Health Service, NHS, was born out of this vision, proof that compassion could be a cornerstone of progress. In France, farmers returned to the fields, factories resumed production, and cities like Paris reclaimed their vibrance. But more importantly, the French people rediscovered their confidence. They looked forward, not back. The same energy that once built empires was now used to build a peaceful Europe. And then there was Japan, a nation that had suffered unimaginable devastation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reminders of the horrors of war. But Japan did something astonishing. They decided not to dwell in shame or sorrow. They turned their focus to progress. The Japanese people rebuilt their economy from zero, emphasizing education, discipline, and innovation. Within 2 decades, Japan became an industrial and technological powerhouse. The world watched in awe as a country once destroyed by war became a symbol of transformation and perseverance. But these national stories were only part of the greater human story. Behind every statistic, there were individuals who refused to give up. In the ruins of Warsaw, teachers held classes in basements to educate children surrounded by rubble. In Russia, women replaced fallen men in factories and fields, driving tractors and producing steel. In Italy, communities rebuilt entire towns by hand, brick by brick. Across Asia and Africa, nations inspired by the post-war recovery began their own struggles for independence and identity. Meanwhile, in the United States, something historic was taking shape. America had emerged from the war as an economic giant, but it chose not to hoard that power. Instead, it extended a helping hand through the Marshall Plan, providing billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Europe. It wasn't just charity, it was vision. The American leadership understood that a prosperous world is a peaceful world. This act of generosity became a cornerstone of global cooperation. It reminded the world that peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of opportunity. When one nation rises, it can lift others with it. Beyond economics and politics, the post-war world saw a rebirth of values. The creation of the United Nations marked humanity's collective desire to avoid another catastrophe. It wasn't perfect, it still isn't, but it represented hope. For the first time in history, nations sat together to resolve conflicts through dialogue instead of destruction. The arts also flourished during this period. Music, literature, and cinema became the voice of a generation that had seen too much pain to stay silent. Writers penned stories of courage and redemption. Painters captured the beauty of survival. Filmmakers told tales of human endurance that inspired millions. Creativity became the therapy of a wounded world. The story of rebuilding after World War II is not a story of government. There comes a moment in every tragedy when survival is no longer enough, when humanity must decide whether to live in the shadow of the past or step into the light of a new beginning. That moment arrived after World War II. For 6 long years, the world had been drowning in chaos. But when the war finally ended, the silence that followed revealed something profound. The realization that war could destroy nations, but it could not destroy the human will to rebuild. The fire that once consumed the earth began to fuel a different kind of revolution, a revolution of rebuilding, of reimagining what civilization could become. The turning point came not through governments or generals, but through a shift in mindset, a collective awakening. Humanity began to understand a truth it had ignored for centuries. We could no longer afford to be divided. The power that once built empires now needed to build peace. In 1945, as cities smoldered and families mourned, the world gathered to ask a single, defining question: what kind of world do we want to live in now? And for the first time in modern history, nations answered with unity instead of vengeance. It began with cooperation. The United States, learning from the mistakes made after World War I, launched the Marshall Plan, a bold, visionary move that poured life back into Europe's shattered economy. Trains began to move again. Farmers began to produce again. Children returned to school. The lights of Paris, London, and Rome began to shine once more, not because of victory, but because of shared purpose. This was the true victory of World War II, not the end of fighting, but the beginning of rebuilding. In Japan, the turning point was even more dramatic. The war had left the nation devastated, but instead of succumbing to defeat, Japan made a powerful decision to reinvent itself completely. With discipline, humility, and relentless work ethic, the Japanese people transformed their nation into a hub of innovation. From ashes came automation. From sorrow came strength. Within 2 decades, Japan became one of the world's strongest economies, a living symbol that pain can be a catalyst for greatness. Meanwhile, in Europe, former enemies began to talk, and not about revenge, but about reconciliation. France and Germany, nations that had fought 3 wars in 70 years, signed agreements that would later lead to the birth of the European Union. The message was clear: progress requires partnership. The Soviet Union, too, turned its wartime industry toward reconstruction, rebuilding entire cities destroyed by the Nazi invasion. Even in ideological opposition, there was progress: space exploration, science, education, all fueled by the same human drive to rise beyond ruin. The turning point wasn't just economic or political, it was deeply human. People began to believe that the world could be better than it had ever been before. After witnessing the worst of humanity, they dared to imagine the best. Mothers who had buried their sons began teaching their children about peace. Soldiers who had fought across continents began to speak about unity. Scientists turned their focus from destruction to discovery. Inventors started thinking about how to connect the world instead of divide it, and something magical happened. Innovation exploded. The world entered an age of rapid progress: medicine, technology, education, communication, all advancing at a pace never seen before. The same creativity that once designed weapons now built bridges, hospitals, and dreams. The 1950s and 1960s became decades of reinvention. Nations invested in infrastructure, in education, in the belief that the next generation would not repeat the mistakes of the last. The cities that had been bombed to dust became symbols of modern architecture and human achievement. But let's be clear, the turning point was not born out of comfort. It came from pain, loss, and reflection. Humanity had to look into its own darkness before it could reach for light. It was the collective understanding that war had shown what we were, capable of destroying, and now we had to prove what we were capable of creating. This era became the birth of a new world mindset, belief that nations rise not by domination, but by cooperation, not by power, but by progress. And for the first time in modern history, we began to think like one species sharing one planet. The United Nations became a stage for diplomacy instead of destruction. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights gave voice to values that transcended borders: dignity, freedom, equality. The World Health Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, all emerged from this same moment of awakening. These institutions weren't perfect, but they represented something humanity had never attempted before. Global systems built not for war, but for welfare. The true turning point wasn't a single event. It was a transformation of consciousness. Humanity learned that rebuilding wasn't just about laying bricks or balancing economies. It was about redefining what it meant to be human. We learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to rebuild even when fear is everywhere. We learned that unity isn't weakness. It's the foundation of every lasting victory. We learned that peace is not given. It's built day by day through effort, empathy, and endurance. The people of that generation faced hunger, poverty, and pain, but they also gave us the modern world. They gave us flight, television, satellites, computers, and the dream of reaching the stars. They showed that even after total collapse, humanity can rise higher than ever before. Think about that. In less than 25 years after the war, we landed on the moon. A species that had nearly destroyed itself reached for the heavens. That was the ultimate symbol of the turning point, from a world divided by conflict to a world united by curiosity. And that's the message we must carry forward. Every era has its turning point, and every generation must decide whether it will rise or retreat. The post-war generation made their choice. They rebuilt, they reinvented, and they refused to remain broken. Today we face our own challenges: war, division, inequality, climate change, fear. But the lesson of history is clear. Humanity rises strongest after it has fallen hardest. The people of 1945 didn't rebuild because they were fearless. They rebuilt because they had no choice but to believe in something better. And that belief changed the world. So when everything seems impossible, when the world feels dark again, remember this truth. The greatest turning point in history wasn't marked by victory or defeat. It was marked by the moment humanity decided to rise. That's the power of rebuilding. That's the legacy of resilience. And that's the story that still calls to every one of us. The call to rise, to rebuild, and to make our own turning point matter. When the world was buried under ashes, humanity did not vanish. It rose. When every street was broken, every dream shattered, and every nation scarred, people still found the strength to believe in tomorrow. The story of rebuilding after World War II is not just history. It is the living proof of what the human spirit can do when there is nothing left. but faith, effort, and courage. They could have surrendered. They could have stayed broken. But instead, they chose the harder path, the path of rebuilding. And in that choice, they redefined what it means to be human. They taught us that hope is not born from comfort, it is forged in crisis. They showed us that greatness is not inherited, it is built brick by ordinary people who refuse to give up. They reminded us that even when the night seems endless, the dawn always belongs to those who keep working through the dark. Look around you. Every bridge, every building, every freedom you enjoy today was paid for by the hands of those who built from ruins. They did not build for themselves. They built for the future, for you, for us, and now that torch has passed. The question is no longer how they rebuilt the world, it's how we will rebuild ours, because every generation faces its own kind of war. Maybe not with bombs or armies, but with fear, division, and doubt. And just like them, we must decide, will we collapse or will we rise? If history teaches us anything, it's this: no fall is final, and no darkness is permanent. As long as humanity breathes, there is always a way to rebuild. So when the world tests you, when everything you love seems lost, remember 1945. Remember the cities that rose again. Remember the people who had nothing, yet gave everything. Remember that even from the ashes, humanity builds miracles, because this is not just their story, it is ours. And like them, we too will rise. We will rebuild. We will redefine what is possible. And we will prove, once again, that the human spirit is unbreakable.